If you're expecting Brendan Fraser yelling at a bandage-wrapped Boris Karloff knockoff, you're watching the wrong Mummy. Lee Cronin just turned this franchise into a grief-core body horror, and somehow it still connects all the way back to Boris Karloff in 1932 and the Brendan Fraser adventure era. Welcome to A Constantly Racing Mind, where we dive into sci-fi, horror, action-adventure, prop culture, and all things geek, through long-form breakdowns and spoiler-heavy deep dives. So if you like your monster movies unpacked down to the props, the mythology, and the messed up family dynamics, go ahead and hit subscribe, ring the bell, and drop a like so YouTube knows you want more. Today we are unwrapping the Mummy from Karloff to Cronin and figuring out how we ended up with two completely different Mummy franchises existing at the same time. So when people talk about what a mummy story should be, I think the first place to go is not the Brendan Fraser movies. It is the universal 1932 The Mummy with Boris Karloff, because that film tells us something important right away. The original Mummy movie is not mainly a bandaged monster rampage. Karloff is only in the full mummy wrapping briefly at the beginning. After that, the film becomes something much stranger, quieter, and more romantic in a dark, obsessive way. It is really about Imhotep surviving through time, taking on another identity, and trying to reclaim his lost love across the centuries. And that is important because the film's development tells the same story. Universal wanted another horror hit after Dracula and Frankenstein, and Carl Laemmle Jr. looked at the huge public fascination with Tutankhamun's tomb and the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs. But they did not start with some established mummy formula. There was no famous novel to adapt. Instead, story editor Richard Shire and writer Nina Wilcox Putnam came up with an original treatment called Cagliostro. And that version was not even about a mummy in the way people think of one. It was about an ancient immortal figure, a magician-like man living into modern times. Then John L. Balderston reworked that concept into an Egyptian story built around resurrection, reincarnation, and lost love. So from the beginning, the core of the Mummy was not fortune and glory. It was immortality, obsession, and the refusal to let the dead stay dead. That is why the 1932 movie plays the way it does. Imhotep is not just a monster. He is a man who was buried alive for trying to resurrect Anak-e-Samanun, the woman he loved. In the present day, after he is revived, he moves through the world as Ardith Bey, manipulates archaeologists, rediscovers her tomb, and becomes convinced that Helen Grosvenor is the reincarnation of that lost woman. The whole story turns on its need to restore the past and undo death itself. The horror comes from obsession, sacrilege, and spiritual trespass, not just from a wrapped corpse walking around. And even the production supports that reading. Karl Freund directs the film with atmosphere, stillness, and eerie visual control, not with action. Boris Karloff's fully bandaged look took an enormous amount of effort from Jack Pierce, reportedly about 8 hours to apply. Yet Universal only used that look briefly. That tells you everything. The image of the mummy was iconic, but the movie itself understood that the real character was not the bandages. The real character was the ancient soul underneath them, still moving through the modern world with unfinished desire. So when I ask what a mummy story really is, I do not think the answer is just a priest cheated out with a queen and now there is a curse. That is a background. It matters, but it's not the full dramatic engine. And I also do not think the answer is that the mummy is just a spooky excuse for an adventure plot. That is what later versions, especially the more pulpy ones, built on top of this iconography. The 1932 film is telling a more intimate and more tragic story. It's about love becoming possession, death being treated as a temporary inconvenience, and the ancient world reaching into the modern one through desire and ritual. That is why I think the original Mummy is closer in spirit to Gothic romance and supernatural fixation than into a tomb raiding adventure movie. Yes, archaeology is there. Yes, curses are there. Yes, ancient Egypt is there. But that is the framing. The real story is Imhotep trying to force love, fate, and death to obey him. That is what makes the Mummy film in the deepest sense. The mummy is not just a monster costume. The mummy is a human being preserved past the point at which he should have ever remained in the story at all. I grew up with Indiana Jones. The Last Crusade hit in 1989 and I was all in. Globe-trotting adventure, great characters, and yes, a lot of great props. When Stephen Sommers showed up 10 years later and applied that same energy to a classic Universal monster property, I was completely on board. Now the 1999 Mummy wasn't high art, it was Brendan Fraser being charming, Rachel Weisz being brilliant, Arnold Vosloo being menacing, and Ray Harryhausen-inspired creature work doing heavy lifting in every action sequence. I loved every minute of it, and I loved all the props that came with it as well. Which is exactly why you need to understand what Lee Cronin is doing and what he's deliberately walking away from. To appreciate why Cronin's The Mummy is such a radical departure, you need to have a look at what the franchise has actually been across nearly a century. Because it has never been one thing. It has always oscillated between two identities, atmospheric dread and popcorn adventure, and every generation has got a different version. Boris Karloff's 1932 original was a slow burn, a thick atmosphere film built around Karloff's haunting physical presence. Predating the modern rating system entirely, no jump scares, no spectacle, just dread. Then Universal's classic monster era gave way to decades of dormancy, except for the Hammer films, until Sommers reinvented the property as a PG-13 action franchise. Those 9 years, 1999 to 2008, produced films that were genuinely fun, but they were adventure films wearing a monster movie costume. The Mummy's identity had shifted from nightmare to theme park ride. Then came 2017 and Universal's Dark Universe experiment with Tom Cruise. That version couldn't decide what it was, horror, action, or franchise launcher, and paid the price for it. It landed in the worst possible place. Too confusing to be fun, too safe to be scary. Then a 9-year gap followed the Sommers trilogy. Another 9-year gap followed the Dark Universe misfire. We are apparently on a very slow clock with this property. Which brings us to 2026 and a filmmaker who has decided to stop hedging. Lee Cronin is the first director in this franchise's history to bring home an R rating. That alone should tell you something. But what tells you more is how he describes his own film. He says, an insane mashup of 1 part Poltergeist and 1 part Seven. Sit with that for a second. Think about it. Poltergeist is an intimate domestic horror, a family home as the site of supernatural violation. Seven is bleak, procedural, and relentlessly grim. Neither of those words, intimate, bleak, has ever been associated with a Mummy film before. Gone are the CGI sandstorms and the ancient pharaohs hunting stolen gold. Cronin's film centers on the Cannon family, whose teenage daughter Katie returns after vanishing for 8 years. What she brings back with her is not good news. The supernatural force in this film doesn't manifest as a linen-wrapped monster stalking through corridors. It functions as a viral superorganism, something that infects and transforms. Katie's return isn't a rescue story. It's a containment story, and the horror is deeply physical. The mummy in this film is a teenage girl cycling through different stages of necrosis, requiring between 5 and 8 hours of prosthetic makeup daily. Her younger sister Maud becomes infected too. This is not your father's mummy, and it's specifically, deliberately, not your father's mummy. Cronin himself describes the film as a meditation on grief, about the weight of guilt and blame that settles on a family after loss. The family's whole world before Katie's disappearance, the 8 years of moving on, the impossible question of whether to keep going. All of it is the horror, and the supernatural element just makes it literal. That's the elevated horror lineage Cronin is drawing from. The tradition of films like Hereditary, Saint Maud, The Night House, Relic, and We Bury the Dead, where grief isn't the backstory, it's the actual horror. The supernatural element doesn't replace the emotional wound. It literalizes it, makes it visible, makes it impossible to look away from. Annihilation does something similar, burying a marriage guilt inside a body horror nightmare. Now, here's where it gets interesting from an audience perspective. So if you're my age and you grew up loving the Sommers films, Cronin's version is going to require some adjustment. We carry that franchise's DNA. We remember the Magi, the Imhotep sandstorm face, the Book of the Dead. We have a prior relationship with this IP that colors how we walk into any new version. For better or worse, we have baggage and movie pops. And Gen Z doesn't, and that's actually a significant advantage for Cronin. A generation raised on A24's elevated horror, Hereditary, Midsummer Men, and on the visceral intensity of Evil Dead Rise, which Cronin himself directed, is going to walk into The Mummy 2026 without the nostalgia filter. They're not going to spend the first act quietly waiting for Brendan Fraser to show up. They don't need the globe-trotting adventure setup. What they do speak fluently is domestic trauma, body horror, and the kind of bleak procedural dread that Cronin is promising to deliver. The film is being made in their cinematic language. Now, the marketing knew exactly who it was talking to. A teaser trailer embedded a hidden message in the Morse code. A chilling warning about dark spirits and visions of the dead for fans to decode online. That's not a marketing strategy aimed at a casual 1999 nostalgist. That's a community-building campaign for the audience that treats film engagement as participatory. The R rating drives the same signal. This isn't family-friendly adventure. Full stop. Grief-forward horror took over because horror is uniquely good at making grief visible. A monster, a haunting, or a possession can do on-screen what grief does internally. It invades, distorts, isolates, and refuses to leave. Then the culture of the last decade, especially the pandemic years, gave filmmakers a lot of loss, anxiety, and broken family structures to work through. And on the business side, horror became the easiest way to get bleak, painful drama financed, marketed, and taken seriously. So grief did not just become a theme, it became the genre's most useful engine. And that is where the comparison to Lee Cronin's The Mummy gets interesting. Because the question is not just whether Cronin includes sarcophagi, rot, Egypt, or body horror. The real question is whether he taps into that deeper mummy tradition, the dead returning with unfinished emotional business and the past refusing to stay buried. Cronin absolutely does that, even if he takes it in a more modern horror direction. The 1932 film is about Imhotep reaching across time to reclaim the woman he lost. Cronin's film is about a family that loses a daughter and then gets her back in a form that makes that return feel monstrous. That is still a mummy story in the older, deeper sense. It's still about return, violation of death, emotional obsession, and the living refusing to accept the natural boundary between loss and restoration. The difference is that Cronin filters all of that through possession, infection, family trauma, and body horror instead of Gothic reincarnation romance. So for me, the real dividing line is this. If someone says a mummy story has to be an Indiana Jones-style fortune and glory adventure, I think that is actually the later pop version talking. That is not the original DNA. The original DNA is death disturbed, love corrupted, and the ancient world invading the present through one preserved body and one impossible emotional demand. That is why the 1932 film still matters, and that is why a movie like Cronin's can still count as a mummy film, even if it is meaner, grosser, and much more possession-heavy than what some viewers expected. The mummy story, at its core, has always been about what comes back and why it cannot let go. And here is the genuinely fascinating wrinkle in all of this. Universal isn't forcing anyone to choose. A separate PG-13 Mummy 4 with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz is reportedly in development for the nostalgia crowd. Warner has moved forward with Cronin's version the same way they greenlit Maggie Gyllenhaal's The Bride, by betting that the market can support two fundamentally different interpretations of the same monster property running simultaneously. One for the adventure fans and one for the horror faithful. Whether that split franchise strategy is bold or just confusing is a legitimate question. but it does tell you something about where the mummy stands in 2026. It is a property with enough cultural real estate to support two completely different conversations about what it should be. Lee Cronin has simply decided which conversation he wants to have. So where does Lee Cronin's The Mummy stand right now? Critically, it is mixed, with 45% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 46 on Metacritic, but the audience side is stronger, with a 76 popcorn meter on Rotten Tomatoes. Financially, the movie has grossed roughly $35 million worldwide, including $14.6 million domestically and another $20.9 million overseas. And once you factor in the reported $22 million production cost, the picture changes a little. This is not some huge runaway success, but it has already grossed well above its production budget, which makes it a much sturdier result than the mixed reviews might suggest at first glance. So right now, The Mummy is living two lives at once. On one side, you got the PG-13 adventure route gearing up for a nostalgic Mummy 4 with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. And on the other, you got Lee Cronin doing an R-rated, grief-infected horror film where the mummy is a teenage girl and a sarcophagus is basically a cursed family therapy session. I don't think one cancels the other one out. Universal and Warner are basically telling us there's enough curse to go around. One lane for the fortune and glory crowd and one lane for the horror faithful. Cronin has just made it very clear which lane he is driving in. If you want more videos where we pull monster franchises apart from the ground up, from 1930s Universal classics to modern elevated horror, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which mummy lineage you're riding with, Karloff, Fraser, or Cronin. And if you want to wear your horror homework on your sleeve, check out the ACRM merch store. I've got designs for classic Universal heads, Evil Dead sickos, and everyone who secretly prefers mummies mean, messy, and emotionally damaged. Link in the description. Thanks for spending some time in the tomb with me today. I know you have a million other videos you could be watching, so it means a lot that you chose to hang out here. So until next time, keep your curses ancient, your bandages tight, your dead where they belong, unless a really good horror director has other plans.